The Kelly legend, as you know, it lives on in prose and poetry and painting and even in a death mask. And Ned was there at the Sydney Olympics. And how is it that a person who killed, admitted that he killed 3 officers of the law, how can it be that he's entered into our consciousness to the degree that here I'm sitting talking about him today? So that's the big question. I didn't come on Saturday, and I haven't come today to argue that Ned was innocent of killing. I think I'd be prepared to argue he was innocent of murder. Ned was born in January 1855. That's 4 years after Victoria had become Victoria. Before that, of course, part of New South Wales. He was born not far out of Melbourne, and his parents, on the one hand, his father was an Irish Tipperary-born convict who had done his time for stealing 2 pigs. He got 7 years transportation to Van Diemen's Land, came across and met Ellen Quinn, whose parents, and she was born in the north of Ireland, in Antrim. They were both Catholics. Ned was the first son, the second child. He was given some education until about the age of 10. His father died when Ned was 11, leaving Mrs. Kelly, Ma Kelly as she was known, with 8 children. Now, the Kelly, Quinn and Lloyd extended family had been in and out of trouble, none of it major, unless one, of course, includes horse and cattle stealing as major crimes, which was the case because in 1873, Ned's younger brother Jim, then aged 13, was sent to prison for 3 years for allegedly having stolen cattle. There were good witnesses to prove that he had no knowledge that the cattle he was droving were stolen. Ned had his first introduction to prison at about the same time. In fact, he was in prison when Jim arrived, and the charge in his case was the stealing of a horse. But Ned, the governor of the prison at Beechworth, was able to testify that on the day Ned was allegedly stealing the horse, on that same day, he was engaged in breaking stones in the prison, to which he'd been already sent for 3 months on what appeared to me to be a trumped-up charge of assaulting a salesman, bush salesman. Now, I'm explaining that simply to illustrate the fact that Ned had, by the time he was 17, already had sufficient experience of the law to know that if they were out to get him, then protestations of innocence were useless, futile. The story unfolded. It was very simple. A young policeman called Alexander Fitzpatrick came out from Benalla, where he was stationed, to the home at Greta, and he arrived back then that evening with a wound, a small wound on his wrist, saying that he'd gone out to arrest young Dan, Ned's another brother, for horse stealing, and that Ned had shot him in the wrist. And the bullet had lodged under the wrist, and Ned thoughtfully had removed it with a penknife. The charges then were Ned, in fact, was in New South Wales at the time. Dan, whether he was there, I can't be too sure. But Dan escaped arrest. Mrs. Kelly was sent to jail for 3 years for having aided and abetted Ned in his attempt to kill Fitzpatrick, or murder Fitzpatrick. A price was put on both Dan and Ned's head. Two other men who were allegedly there, one certainly wasn't, were sent to jail for 6 years for having helped Ned try to kill the policeman. So Ned was, when he arrived back from New South Wales, he knew nothing of this. Now, what in fact had happened was that the young policeman, who was already the father, aged 19, of a child, who was then courting a young lady, Melbourne girl, who was already pregnant, and her parents were begging him to marry her. He was, if you like, notorious for his attention to young females, unwanted, it would seem. Mrs. Kelly, who was out the back, came in to find Fitzpatrick. The family always said publicly, when I say publicly, amongst themselves and their friends and so on, trying to rape Kate. See, in those days, for a girl to have to carry the stigma, as it was seen, of having been raped, was virtually to sign the warrant for your own lifetime. And indeed, poor Kate finished up drowned in a creek, probably suicided, out near Forbes. She's buried next to Ben Hall, incidentally. But that was hushed up. Ned insisted, when he heard the story and met Dan, that nothing be said to involve Kate. So that was not admitted. Ned and Dan both offered to give themselves up to the police if they would release their mother. They loved their mother very deeply. And of course, no notice was taken of that offer, so they were hunted. And the police made it clear that if they got the chance, they'd kill the Kellys. Now, it's a complicated story, but it resulted, and I entitled the chapter of my book that deals with the killing of the 3 policemen at Stringy Bar Creek, simply a killer. That Ned was a killer is unquestionable. I mean, he admitted it that time and time again. That the police were out to kill him, that Ned begged, literally begged the police to surrender, is the truth. On the contrary, they drew their guns and they were shot. They had an arsenal of weapons. Ned only had one old rifle that was bound up with wire, but it was a lethal weapon nonetheless, clearly. So the net result of it all, of course, is that Ned was put in court in Melbourne for having, with a forethought and malice, murdered Constable Lonigan, was the first one. And the judge said that the jury was not to bring back a verdict of manslaughter, which gave them no how would I put it, option but to find it guilty, because the evidence from the remaining constable, McIntyre, who had written within 24 hours back at the police station that Constable Lonigan, when Ned said surrender, he went straight for his gun. Now, that was never said in court. So the jury had no option. So Ned was hanged 2 weeks later, but Ned said that he feared death as little as he feared the drinking of a cup of tea, and that he was at ease in his conscience, and that he and Barry and everyone in the courtroom would have to go before a higher court where the difference between right and wrong would be known. And then he said awful words, really. He said to Barry, and I go further and tell you that I will see you there where I go. Well, Ned was executed, as I said, about a week later. Barry lived on for 12 days, and Barry had been in the fullness of his manhood the day he condemned Ned. That kind of thing lived on in legend, if you like. Well, it's not legend, it's more fact. In the interval, Ned was begged McIntyre to get them to surrender. Lonergan was lying dead, of course. But they talked, and McIntyre wrote that, like, Ned to him was a phenomenon that scarcely understood. In other words, incidentally, the four of them were all Irish born, the police. He said that Ned was not Protestant or Catholic. He wasn't Irish or English, but he was this new thing, an Australian. And Ned himself said that he was not prepared to accept being gunned down by foreigners, as he said, in my native land. And I think that all that I can say in that sense about him, he was thoroughly an Australian whose roots were here and only here, whose loyalties were here and only here. That, in that period, was a big thing. Now, how that came to be, I don't know. But I do know that Ned was, for example, he was always immensely respectful of women. He never drank to excess. I don't know whether he engaged in strong language. He was a sportsman of extraordinary ability. He was acknowledged champion boxer of the Northeast. In those days, that boxing, most of us would be regarded as a deplorable pastime, but in those days it wasn't so regarded. But he was an athlete, jump and so on. When he was 10, he saved a child of 6 who was drowning in a creek, a swollen creek. And his loyalty, of course, to his family, as I've already said. Now, I think what we've got to realise is the records we have of Ned are mostly written by those who were anti-Ned. I mean, they're the records of the police, principally, of course, but then the newspapers. We've got the Jerilderie letter and another letter he wrote to a member of Parliament called Cameron, and the language is flamboyantly vital, throbbing with not hatred but anger. He said himself that the one lesson he wanted people to learn from his life was that if those that have authority and power misuse it unjustly, in the end they'll drive men, as Ned said, to madness. That madness, that anger, comes through very strongly because when the Jerilderie letter, Mark Kelly was already in prison. His mother, I mean, it's just ridiculous. What in fact she did was pick up a fire shovel and whack Fitzpatrick on the wrist. This nonsense of Ned coming into a room, not as big as here, with 10 other people in it, firing away like a madman, a man who could shoot with complete accuracy, it was proved regrettably and dreadfully later, and couldn't even shoot Fitzpatrick. The bullet landed. Now, you know, I've asked surgeons, fire a bullet at 2 metres from someone, a revolver, could it sit in the flesh on the wrist? It's just ridiculous. But he got away with it. I should have said Fitzpatrick was sacked eventually, after he'd given his evidence, of course, and too late. He was sacked by the police as an unworthy, lying scoundrel. And I'm using their words. Poor McIntyre, who gave the evidence against Ned for Lonergan's death, and by extension the death of the other two, of course, I mean, he had gone off his head with fear. He spent the night in a wombat hole, he took to the drink, he was in hospital, but they prodded him, if you like, into court where he could give the evidence that Ned shot Lonergan with no provocation. So that when you ask me about Ned, well, you know, I just stand and say, Ned's explained it away by others. He didn't have much control over his own destiny.